Hey, everybody. Just getting online to start our Q&A. There was a lot of questions on Sunday about kind of the supernatural series that we started. And, well, I wouldn't say a lot of questions, but I got a couple immediately. And so we just thought it would be a good idea for you guys, if you have questions, to be able to do a Q&A. I already have 3. And so if you're jumping in, I see a couple people jumping in here. If you're jumping in right now, just encourage you to ask some questions down in the notes. Somebody say hello. I want to make sure that I'm seeing your stuff. So I've got it open here on my computer as well. I don't want to miss any comments. So, all right. So I see a number of people online watching. That is great. So give you a little bit of a catch up really quick. Like I said, we started on, there we go. We started on, oh, did that just flip? What did I do? Oh no. Okay, well, we'll just do this then. Rotate your phone. You can see I'm very good with technology. Okay, all right, hi Trey, thank you. All right, so there it goes. All right, we're in business. So you can see I'm very good with technology, but we're gonna make this work. At any point, if you have a question, I will attempt to answer that question live. I am gonna warn you, some of these are big things, and so if it's too big of a question, I might just table it and to let you know, hey, we're gonna answer that next week. If you didn't already jump in for the message, if you were not at Sonrise on Sunday because you were at another church or you were just absent for some reason, I'd encourage you to go back on our page, just a few posts, and watch the message. If you watch the message first, that's going to be really helpful because to give you a context. Hi, Sherry. All right, so I guess we'll go ahead and we'll just jump into the first one of these questions. And really what we were doing on Sunday, brief context, is we were talking about the Bible and how we are to read the Bible, and in order to see the supernatural world come through. And like I said on Sunday, the gospel is intrinsically supernatural, and so the Bible is a supernatural book, and we want to read it the way that the ancient reader would have read it. So the first question I have here is this. The question is, if the original audience of Genesis 6 understood Genesis to have meaning in the natural world and the supernatural, why can't we allow Genesis to shape how we do science? Wait a minute. Am I sideways? I feel like I'm sideways. I feel like that's better. All right, so I'm going to read that question again. If the original audience of Genesis understood Genesis to have meaning in the natural world and the supernatural, why can't we allow Genesis to shape how we do science? So this was the idea was that the Bible isn't a science book, right? And that's what we talked about Sunday, and I'm not going to unpack that, but the idea is that the Bible isn't a science book, neither is are science books theology books, right? We learn about God from the scriptures, and God reveals other things to us through natural means, but those things aren't mostly theological, although when we get to question 3, you're going to see some of those are to do with God and his creation and the things that he's doing. So to address this question, why can't we allow Genesis to shape how we do science? I am going to revisit some things that I said in the message, but maybe didn't say quite as clearly. What it comes down to basically is that God speaks through the language of the culture to communicate spiritual truths. And what I mean by that is that where the scriptures are a divine book, completely everything that God wanted to be in the scriptures are in it. All of the wisdom of God that he designed for us as the church is in the scriptures. But God also, Peter tells us, spoke through human authors. And so that's why we see stylistic differences from book to book, right? Every single book of the Bible is not identical in its form and in its language. And that's because God worked through the humanity, right? The human culture of the individual authors in order to express things to us, right? So if we see that the individual cultures and the stylistic differences of the original authors are there, then definitely there's going to be other things from the culture that come to influence the scriptures, right? And so I want to give you an example of how this happens, right? So and then I'll answer the question a little better. So if you remember back to when we went through 1 Corinthians, and if you weren't there for that, you can jump to our website, sonrisepalmdale.com, go click on messages, and then scroll down until you find our Corinthians series. And this would be the first message on 1 Corinthians 11. And in 1 Corinthians 11, we've got this really bizarre story about, but really bizarre teaching about head coverings. And I'm not going to revisit that all here, but what essentially it comes down to in that story is that there's a teaching that Paul gave because of what the culture understood about hair, and they believed that hair was a human sex organ, and I won't go into that. I went to detail in the message, and you can go listen to the message for all that, but that's what they believed. And so then when they were in the presence of divine beings and things of that sort, they wanted their heads to then be covered so that they weren't improper. And so that was the context. And so Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 11 about that cultural context. Now, just because he addressed this issue of head coverings and addressed this idea that hair is a human sex organ doesn't mean that we agree with Paul's science, right? And so that's kind of the idea, is we know that's absurd based on what we know about human anatomy. And so we don't look at 1 Corinthians and go, well, no, it's in the Bible, so it must be true exactly according to how Paul thought about it. That must definitely be it. And we don't go and rewrite what we know about science and medicine and anatomy and all of that just because of what Paul said, right? So that's a really, really bizarre example. But then when we go back to Genesis 1, all right? When we go to Genesis 1 and you're like, well, is Genesis 1... how literally do we read it? Do we believe in a 6-day creation? Don't we? Do we believe in parts of it? Do we not believe in other parts? Well, that's a good question. But I'll tell you how to read it first. How to read it first is to read it as a theology book and not a science book. Okay? So when you read Genesis 1, you're reading it as a theology book, not a science book, because it didn't intend to do science. It's not actually what Genesis 1 was for. Case in point, if we go to Colossians 1:6, and I'm just going to pull that up here, 1:16, I apologize. Colossians 1:16, I believe we get a taste of what the biblical authors in the New Testament actually believed about the creation account. So Colossians 1:16 says, "For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him." What we see in that text is that at least as far as the Apostle Paul was concerned, the most important thing about creation was that Jesus created it, and he created it for himself, right? And so it's not, there's no discourse as to how creation occurred. The how isn't significant here for Paul. It's the what and the why. It's that Jesus created and why he created it. And we see that come up again. If you go to 1 John 1 through 14, you see that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you go through that chapter, it talks about some of the same things. Jesus created, and everything that was created for Jesus. And then we see this again in Revelation 4:11, and there's shadows of it in many other places in the New and Old Testament. In fact, I couldn't find a scripture, and I would love to know if there is one, but I couldn't find a scripture that pointed back to the creation account that had anything to do with the ordering of it or anything like that, right? So I couldn't find anywhere in the Older New Testament where a biblical author was saying, hey, look, there's a thing here, right, where it was created in this way for this purpose. And nobody's talking about how creation actually occurred once we get outside of Genesis 1. So that's the idea there. And I'd love, again, if you know the verse for that, I'd love to hear it. Now, the point was not to suggest that Genesis 1 is merely a myth, though, right? So we're talking about, to be clear, we're talking about the difference between people who say Genesis 1, strict 6-day creation, exactly, 24-hour periods, exactly how it occurred, exactly how it appears to be written. By the way, when we say that, we are saying exactly how it appears to be written in our English Bibles, because in the Hebrew, it does not read exactly the same as it does in the English, which we will talk about next week and in further weeks. But yeah, so, we're talking strict 6-day creation versus the polar opposite end, which is like, well, this is just a myth and we should throw everything scientific or historical out, because it's just a myth. And that would be where, if you were raised as, believing in evolution and an old earth and, billions of years and so on and so forth and the Big Bang and all of that, then you would read Genesis 1 and you would go, well, certainly this is just a myth that's meant to teach that God created, but not how God created, that it was created for Jesus, but it's not telling us how, right? But I think there's a lot of wiggle room in the middle. Maybe wiggle room isn't the right way to say that. There's a lot of room in the middle there, and so I would encourage you to wrestle with it, to look at what science teaches, to look at what the Bible teaches, and first of all, to do theology with the Bible, to do science with science, and reason, but also to engage the scriptures on an intellectual level as science informs them, and vice versa. Like, I'm totally okay with that. In fact, C.S. Lewis acknowledged that that Christianity anyway, was very mythological, right? We don't like that word myth. It makes us think of the Greek gods and Zeus and Athena and all of that, which, don't miss church on Sunday if you're into Greek mythology. But anyway, so, it makes us think of all those things when we say myth. But myth is what a lot of it is. When we talk about Job and Jonah and Daniel, there's mythological elements. Now, being myth doesn't make it not true. Right? And so that's what we've got to wrestle with. And C.S. Lewis knew that. So he actually said that Christianity is the myth that is true. Right? Christianity is the myth that is true. And so just because I say do theology with the Bible and do science with reason doesn't mean that I'm saying there's nothing scientific represented in the scriptures or that there's nothing theological represented in the world. Because in fact, there are theological things that are represented in science and that we can derive by reason from the world. And that's actually our third question today. So so if you have a question about that, shoot it over. I think I dealt with that well, but just be smart as you read scripture and be not smart. I don't want to be patronizing. Sorry about that. But anyway, be thoughtful, right? Like when you read the book of Kings, you're reading something that was intended to be historical. But Genesis, at least for the first nine chapters or so, just doesn't read that way. It doesn't read like something that's meant to be historical. To be honest with you, it reads a lot like mythology, right? And so wrestle with those things, okay? That's the first question. So I'll give you a second. Did anybody have a question, bridging from that? Something that you're thinking, did I not say something clearly you want me to deal with? I'll give you a second. Take a long drink. Okay. Well, let's go to question 2 then, because... So question 2 is this, and I rephrased it a little bit to make it clear, but it says, you mentioned that there are evil beings locked up in gloomy darkness until the day of judgment. By the way, that's a reference to the book of Jude. So you mentioned that there are evil beings locked up in gloomy darkness until the day of judgment. Here's the question. Are those other beings as bad as Satan since they were locked up until judgment? So notice the presupposition of the question first is that Satan isn't locked up. That's the idea, right? Let's just talk about some of these ideas. So who is Satan? First of all, Satan is if you want to put it in the courtroom setting, Satan is like God's prosecuting attorney. That's his job. He's there to make accusations against anybody being judged, be it angel or saint or whoever, right? And so that was a weird thing to say, but we'll talk about that in a few weeks too. Judging angels. Anyway, that's Satan's job, is to be a prosecuting attorney and to say things like he did in the garden. Did God really say? And to test human knowledge and to see if we know in fact what is. And so that's Satan's job. Now, do I think he does his job? Do I think he does his job well? That's not a good statement. Do I think he did his job well? No, I don't. Right? In the garden, he did not do his job well. He tempted and he deceived. But he did his job, and that's what he was there to do. Why was there even a snake in the garden? Well, because God created a prosecuting attorney in his courtroom, and he was there, right? So Satan did his job. And in fact, he didn't really break any of God's laws. As I look at the testimony of those scriptures, I don't find Satan disobeying God until after Jesus comes on the scene, right? So Jesus is born, and you're like, what? What are you talking about? Jesus is born, right? And this is when Satan gets into... good question, Danielle. Danielle asked, where are these questions coming from? I'm not entirely sure where all three of them came from. I think the first one came from Matt. I'm not sure how he communicated it. Jamie gave it to me. The second question came from a comment by Mary on one of the posts about Sunday's sermon on our Facebook page. So good question. If you have a question, drop it right there, and I would love to try to tackle it while we're online today. So yeah, so we were talking about so Satan didn't break God's laws right then and there, right? When Satan broke God's laws was actually before the crucifixion, when John tells us that, or I'm sorry, not John, Luke tells us that John indwelled Judas Iscariot. The devil, it's late. I'm not using words well. That the devil indwelled Judas Iscariot. Satan indwelled or possessed Judas Iscariot. Okay, that's when he broke a boundary. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Where does it say that that's a law you can't break? Like, where does it say that in the Bible? And frankly, there's no command that says, and to the demons thou shalt not possess human beings. There's nowhere that it says that. But if you go to the story in the Synoptic Gospels, when Jesus goes to the island of Gennesaret, right, and there's the man, in one account it's one man, in the other account it's two, and in these accounts there's a demon possessed man or two demon possessed men named Legion, and Legion isn't their name. Legion is the name of the demon because there's a legion of demons in this man, right? And when Jesus is going to cast these demons out, they make a request of him, and they say, well, please don't cast us into the abyss, right? Or into the pit might be another way to say it, but the abyss is the word that's using. Don't cast that. They implored him, do not cast us into the abyss, but allow us to go into the pigs. And Jesus granted that. And that's interesting because what that passage teaches, whether you realize it or not, is that every time Jesus cast a demon out of a human being, in the New Testament, that demon did not go back out into the world in order to go possess somebody else. That demon went to the abyss. In other words, that demon went to be chained in gloomy darkness. So we get this sense that although there are evil spirits on the earth, and they're out there, that there are boundaries that they are not allowed to follow. Right? They're not allowed to cross, is what I should say. There's boundaries. And so this, the indwelling human beings is one of the things that it appears that spirits in the unseen realm are not allowed to do. And if they do, they are punished by being cast into the abyss, into gloomy darkness, to be chained until the day of judgment. So that's kind of interesting. And so John actually records in Revelation that the abyss was actually created for the devil and his angels, right? And so you're like, whoa, okay, well, that's what it's for, right? It's for casting them into gloomy darkness. So that's the teaching. There are lines. And so it's my belief, actually, that Satan, after indwelling Judas Iscariot, that he was punished for that he was cast into gloomy darkness, and that Satan doesn't walk the earth today. That's actually my belief. And you're like, whoa, what are you talking about? What do you mean the devil is bound in chains in gloomy darkness? And well, that's what I believe, and I know that most people don't believe that. And the biggest biggest question is, well, what do you believe about demons then? Like if there's no Satan, then where are the demons? And my answer to that is, well, I think it's fairly obvious to me as somebody who's biblically learned and watching the supernatural world happen around us, that there are still supernatural beings, many of which I would definitely call demons, that are out there, that are oppressing people, that are doing all sorts of other things, that are tormenting and oppressing and all the different things that for whatever reason God allows them to do. But there are not, but I don't believe Satan's there, and that doesn't bother me anyway. I mean, let's be honest. What does Satan want with you or me? Like we're not the big fish, right? Oh, Danielle, that's a great question. Danielle asked, so are you saying that angels have the ability to possess humans but choose not to? I'm hesitant for that question. Oh, it's one of those big questions. So I'm going to answer it shortly, and then we're going to just snip it, but we're going to deal with it in future weeks at one point. I'm not sure exactly what week offhand. But when we say demons, we are not properly talking about, we are not actually properly talking about fallen angels. So Satan is a fallen angel. There are at least 70, as many as possibly 200 other fallen angels, sometimes they're often referred to as the Watchers. Okay, and so they're out there. But when we say demon, what we're really talking about from the worldview of the ancient, especially the New Testament writers and the New Testament audience. What we're really talking about when we say demon is a disembodied spirit. In other words, a spirit that's no longer in a body. Hi, Josue. So, yeah, we're talking about a spirit that's no longer in a body. And so I'm not sure I can make a good biblical argument that an angel is not in a body, because an angel is strictly speaking a part of the divine creation. And so they are not a physical creation. They're part of the divine creation. So I guess my answer to the question, Danielle, is that I don't know if an angel can actually possess a human being. I know that a disembodied spirit that has been allowed to remain on the earth can possess a human being. So there's my answer. So back to the question, are those other beings as bad as Satan since they were locked up until judgment? These beings were at least as bad as Satan, I guess. I don't know if I want to make a moral judgment, but they were bad in the same way as Satan when Satan possessed Judas, right? So they were bad in the same way. If you go to Genesis 6, for instance, and I'll pull that up, we actually get, and we'll deal with this more in future weeks, but what we see in Genesis 6 is actually the account of the angels, or not the angels, but the beings that are locked up in gloomy darkness. We see them show up in Genesis 6, and it's not obvious, so I'll explain it to you. We will make it obvious in a couple of weeks, but Genesis 6 says this: when mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of mankind were beautiful. Now that word sons of God is important because that's sort of like begotten language, like we see in the New Testament. That doesn't mean properly sons, as in physical offspring of God. What it tends to refer to in the Old Testament, dare I say exclusively, is the divine creation. And this is something that's going to come up this week, though the term sons of God is going to come up this week, or sons of the Most High is one of the ways that it's often said also. And so we're going to talk about that this week. And sons of the Most High or sons of God that's actually a reference to the divine creatures, the divine creation. Right? And so that's really what we're talking about. We are talking about the sons of God looking and seeing that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they chose as wives for themselves. Okay? In other words, divine beings, and again, we call these are the Watchers here, and we'll talk about that more in weeks to come. But the divine beings took as wives the daughters of men, which means some translations say came into the daughters of men, right? Took as wives is like took by force as wives, the daughters of men, and bore children by them. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and afterwards when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind who bore children to them. Okay, so we see here, much like possession, there was another offense that got these guys locked up in gloomy darkness. So can I say that divine beings raping human women is worse than Satan possessing Judas Iscariot? I don't even know that I can make that judgment and say one is worse than the other, but I can say that in God's eyes, both are punishable by being locked up in gloomy darkness. All right, so Trey mentioned heavenly host as well with a question mark. And so that heavenly host terminology is really interesting. It's funny that he said that because he's actually going to preach on angels in a couple of weeks, or on the heavenly host in a couple of weeks. But it's a good question. Heavenly host tends to refer to all of, well, at least in the New Testament, it tends to refer to the divine beings who are faithful to God, faithful to Jesus, and not to the other ones. And so I'm going to tentatively say, no, this would not include the heavenly host. I think I answered that question the way it was asked. So I just got a text said, it looks like you lost your signal. No, I've still got it. Okay. Anybody have a question on that point? Okay. Thank you. All right. So question 3. This would be a good place to jump in if somebody has their own question at this point about anything preached last week, any weird things I mentioned about the unseen realm. Give you a minute. All right, so the third question, and I mentioned this was coming, was this. If God put his nature and power on display in his natural creation, what supernatural truths can we know from the natural world? Okay, so this question is really cool. So this question is saying, because I kind of reserved on Sunday and said, don't do theology with science, right? And then I said, well, there is a couple of things, right? There are a couple of things we can learn, and that's what the author of this question, who I'm not sure who it is, but anyway, that's what the author of this question is pointing to. So can we do some theology using science? And the answer is yes. However, I will reserve we can only do theology with science in this case because the biblical authors tell us how this works. So if we go to Romans 1, and I'm just going to read to you verses 18 through 20. Because verses 18 through 20 tell us that there are things available in the natural creation that we can learn. So the Apostle Paul says this. I'll read the whole passage and make a couple of comments on it as I go. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their righteousness suppress the truth." So right there, number 1, judgment. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven. I mean, it just doesn't get any clearer than that, right? So the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. That's the first thing that we can know from the creation, is that God judges. As we go on, it says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made." All right, so now we see some things that are clearly revealed in the creation of the world. 2 things. First is God's eternal power. The word we tend to use for that is omnipotence, that God is powerful over all things, that everything exists through him and by him and for him, and all power in the world comes from God. It's Jesus who is holding all things together. As sin is attempting to tear apart this creation, Jesus, by his power, holds it together, right? And so that's what we call omnipotence, all-powerful. And we know that God is all-powerful because of the creation. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The next thing we know is that we can know God's divine nature. And that is to say that God was not created. What kind of nature does God have? Well, he doesn't have a natural nature. He has a divine nature. He was not created, but is in fact creator. And this is incidentally, as we'll talk about next week, is how God differs from other divine beings, right? And what's the if an angel is a divine being and God is a divine being, what's the difference? Well, one is a creature; it was created. That's the angel, and one is the God of the universe that is uncreated, not created, and that's God, very God. Okay, so we learn that God is the creator and not the created, right? And so I want to talk about these. And then the last one, so they are without excuse, is what Paul says. And they, referring to people, are without excuse. In other words, God's made himself apparent in the creation. And so we are without excuse. And that is a statement there, by the way, of guilt upon all humanity. So I'll recap the four things. Four things we can learn from creation, at least from this passage, is that God judges, people are guilty, God is powerful, and God is the creator, not the created, right? He's the creator, not the creature. And so, I just wonder if we can talk briefly about how we can actually see these things. Like, how do we actually see it in the creation? How do we see that God judges? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the creation itself, as Paul says in Romans, groans. Right? The creation groans under duress of sin. And people have always kind of looked to things like natural disasters and people of all cultures. I mean, think about like tribal people living on islands with volcanoes, and you see these, we see it like made into comedy and cartoons all the time, like it's funny, but people really sacrificed to the gods by trying to appease the gods by, throwing animals and even humans into volcanoes to try to, because it's a natural disaster. And they just had a sense that God is doing this, right? And so, and everything we see that's broken in the world, it points us to the reality of a creator, God, who judges. It points us to judgment. And if everything points to judgment, we then look at our own lives and we go, well, there's things in my life that are painful, right? And my life hurts at times. And if the pain and the brokenness of the creation, what does that say about me? And that brings us to the fourth statement that he said, that we're without excuse. Because what we can learn from the creation is that not only is God a God of wrath, he's a God who judges, but we as humans are also guilty. And what the Apostle Paul said in Romans 3, quoting David in the Psalms, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. No one is righteous, not one. No one does good, right? That's Genesis 6, right? So we can see that and we can understand that from the creation. I think we do see it practically, that we understand that things don't go my way often. And that means God judges and people are guilty, every one of us. The next thing is that we can see from the creation that God is the creator, not the created, and that God is all-powerful. And those kind of stem one from the other. I just have never, I hear a lot of science that is pretty good. I hear a lot of science that's pretty good. I'm very convinced by a lot of scientific discoveries. And I don't love science, but I like it. And I like, when I'm listening to TED Radio Hour or Hidden Brain or something like that, some other NPR show, I like to listen to it. And I like to learn things about this planet that God has allowed us to live on and, commanded us to have, dominion over. And I think it's very interesting to learn about this planet and to learn about the natural order and all of those things. But the further back you go, the more you have to admit that everything did not come from nothing. And I don't care if you subscribe to the Big Bang Theory or what other theory of creation you subscribe to. I might just not be smart enough. I don't understand the Big Bang Theory fully. So I'm not terribly convinced by it. But like I said, I do like science, and I think some of it is really good. But even if you're going to subscribe to the Big Bang Theory or some other theory, at some point you've got to go all the way back, and you have to say, yeah. But where did it all come from? Everything natural is here, and everything natural is natural law, that everything comes from something. And if everything comes from something, then there had to be a beginning when there was nothing, and there had to be something that isn't bound by the laws of the natural universe that created the first something. right? I mean, it just follows. It has to be that way. That we could not have anything if something that is not natural did not cause something to be in the place of nothing. Something doesn't come from nothing. That's good science. And so, we look at the creation and we study the, rock formations and the stars and all these different wonderful things that God's created. And we have to admit, something created this. Something created this. Something far more intelligent than any of us created this. And if the universe is as big as it is, and it's getting bigger all the time, and if, life and technology and all these things are beginning to, continuing to progress and grow. And I mean, I'm amazed by technology every time I turn around. And if all of this, right? If all of this, then how powerful is that creator? And so those are the two things. And I love it that almost 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul wrote this, that the creation declares God's omnipotence, his eternal power, and also his nature as creator, his divine nature. I think it's amazing. So the creation absolutely does. That was my last question. I'd love if you had another question. I can hang out for a minute and we can see if we can address another one. Or not. Let's see if anybody has one. I'll hang out for a minute. While we're doing that, I just encourage you, this Sunday we are doing a message about God, gods, and the divine council. And if you've never heard the words divine council, they're in your Bible. In Psalm 82, it says it a little different in different, sometimes I think some of them say divine assembly and things like that, or God's assembly. But look at the ESV, Psalm 82. Start reading through that and just thinking through the absolute craziness of the passage of Scripture, because that is our key source text for Sunday as we talk about what does it mean that God is gods, God is God. What on earth does the Bible mean by gods? And what on earth, or what in heaven, right, is a divine council? And so those are the questions that we're really dealing with as we go through that text. And so you don't want to miss that one. And we will, I guess, see you there because I don't see any other questions. One last call for questions. All right, so now you guys know. Take a notebook or, it's an app, Notes, right, on your phone, and write down some questions this Sunday because we'll do this again every week as we go forward. All right, love you guys, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.